Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche candidate for U.S. Senate in New York, and today is Flag Day. It's Friday, June 14th, 2024. We are going to have a discussion this evening on a rather extraordinary and timely press conference convened by the Schiller Institute at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. this past Wednesday, which I, Carl Osgood of EIR, and Dennis Speed, who is here with me as well, all attended. Dennis was the moderator. Carl and I were in the audience and had some questions, but Helga Zepp-LaRouche said that we needed to do something that shifted the silence on the march toward thermonuclear war where we currently find ourselves. And I will play one excerpt that sort of situates that, which is a question from nuclear weapons expert Stephen Starr on the question of the targeting of the Russian early warning radar system, who was doing that, etc. You will get a sense of the tone from Scott Ritter, who was one of the speakers, Colonel Wilkerson, who was there, that they also consider that we are in a really urgent situation and that Americans are somewhat oblivious, that people don't really fear nuclear war. They don't think we could go there, even though the United States is the only country on the planet that actually has used nuclear weapons. And therefore, I would say, as a candidate for office and as an American citizen, it is incumbent on the people of this nation to get us off this trajectory. Now, there's a couple things that I just want to review, and Dave, I'm going to be sharing my screen here in a second. Hopefully I can figure out how to do this. Hold on. Yeah. So one, just in case people don't really think this is urgent or America's not really going to be in the war in the same way that Europe is, etc. Let me just show you. This is from a blog by former Congressman, former presidential candidate, and current independent congressional candidate Dennis Kucinich. America prepares for global war and restarts the draft for 18 to 26-year-olds. And here's this little cartoon, Uncle Sam grabbing out of his poster at two young men walking by, one of whom saying to the other, "I hear recruitment is way down." And what Kucinich wants to draw people's attention to is an amendment which was slipped into the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, of nearly $1 trillion, the defense budget. This little tricky amendment was slipped in by voice vote in the House Armed Services Committee. And here is the amendment. And by the way, this bill passed in the House today earlier, and the amendment is still in it as far as I know. So people really should pay attention here. The amendment reads, Section 531, Selective Service System, Automatic Registration. Quote, except as otherwise provided in this title, every male citizen of the United States and every other male person, think migrant and illegal migrants, refugees, residing in the United States between the ages of 18 and 26 shall be automatically registered under this act by the director of the Selective Service System, unquote. And Kucinich asks the question, why an automatic draft? Members of Congress and the president have an obligation to explain to the American people to which foreign land will their sons and perhaps their daughters be sent to die. And Kucinich makes the point that the U.S. has been in a continuous official state of emergency since September 11th, 2001, which gives the president over 100 powers he would not normally have. So this should scare you. If it doesn't scare you, then perhaps you should check and see if you're sober and awake. Now, I want to also share something else because the whole world knows that Ukraine is not winning the war. They've lost over 500,000 soldiers. And this fiction, what Biden just did at the G7 summit by saying that we're going to continue to support Ukraine, I believe, for the next 10 years, is something else that people should find quite alarming, especially given that Zelensky is no longer a legal president because his term ran out on May 21st, I believe, and there were not elections, and that's even in violation of the Ukrainian constitution, such as it is. So Biden says that the U.S. is going to continue to provide weapons and military equipment to Ukraine, expand intelligence sharing, continue to train Ukrainian troops, make the Ukrainian military NATO standard. This is really arrogant and delusional and very, very dangerous. He also says that they're going to take $50 billion from Russian sovereign assets. We're stealing from the Russian dollar reserves and giving the money to Ukraine, which also is unheard of. And I will say, if people are worried about the dollar surviving, you shouldn't do things like this because it's going to undermine any reliability of the dollar, which we already see happening with the sanctions and other measures we're imposing. In fact, we announced an entirely new round of sanctions against Russia on June 12th, which is the Russia National Day. So adding insult to injury and insanity. And the Russians are now moving to make various transactions with different countries and entities no longer in dollars at all. So in effect, what we are doing is very much like the guy who walks in to rob a bank and points a gun at his own head and says, "Give me all your money or I'll shoot." We are destroying the US economy, claiming we're threatening Russia, but Russia has now even surpassed Japan in their economic as an economy on the planet. So there was just one other update that two other actually I wanted to share, and I'm going to share screen again, Dave, because since Ukraine is losing, the propaganda has to be escalated. And as people may know, they decided that Ramstein, NATO is going to have a whole special arm to prevent quote unquote disinformation. And on June 6th, a group called Texty released a new list of information terrorists. And I'll just show you here as part of the article, texty.org.ua. Now, of interest, this list has a whole bunch of members of the US Congress. It's 300 and something Americans. So now the members of Congress are complaining. They want an investigation. Is the State Department funding a crackdown on free speech of Americans? How can you have the Ukrainian data agency targeting Americans? And this Texty group put out an article called American Swing from Trumpist to Communist, who and how is campaigning, who are campaigning for the end of aid to Ukraine. And then Texty begins crying foul that now they're being questioned for putting this out, that congressmen want to know. It may cut off funding that could hurt free speech in Ukraine, like Zelensky cares about free speech, or censoring 390 Americans as part of free speech. So I am on this list. You can see who's on the page that I am on. Eugene Puryear, Cornel West, who's a presidential candidate at the moment, Lucas Gage, Natalie Morris, and Clayton Morris of Redacted. There I am, Diane Sayre. It has links to various articles and interviews. Tara Reid is on this. Steve Bannon happens to be on my page. It's a pretty wild list. I'll just go to the top so you get a sense. Ben Shapiro, David Sachs, Ron DeSantis, Peter Thiel, Robert Francis Kennedy. They put a presidential candidate, Donald Trump, another presidential candidate, are on this list. So again, doesn't bode well for the United States. This question of freedom of speech is a big deal. Freedom of elections is a big deal. So I'm going to stop there. I would like to actually I'll turn it over to you, Dennis, perhaps, and then you know that I have this clip where Steve Starr asks the question about how this radar facility was bombed, and we can show that shortly, but perhaps you should give sort of an overview first.
Well, I'll say a few things, and thanks for having me on, and just want to welcome everybody that's listening. I think what's important about the press conference, press availability that we held in Washington at the National Press Club, being viewed at the time that it was held by 2,000 people internationally. Within the room, we had several embassies from different nations and several journalists who attended. And then within a 24-hour period after, about 30,000 persons that viewed it. This was not the kind of press availability or discussion that was a generalized discussion. It wasn't the kind of thing that you were going to get millions of, quote, hits on. It wasn't a popular discussion per se. It was tended to be highly, if not so much specialized. It was understandable, comprehensible. It was an intelligible discussion, but it was a hard conversation, a tough conversation. And the people that were participating in that, people like Scott Ritter, he had been the UN weapons inspector that was supposed to find the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq prior to the invasion that we had of 2003. We're talking about 1996. This is the person who had met relatives of the Saddam Hussein family. And these are people of some stature. And then there's Colonel Richard Black, who had been the former head of the U.S. Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, former state senator also from Virginia. And he was also a decorated combat veteran who had been wounded in Vietnam. You had Larry Wilkerson. Now, Larry Wilkerson is well known to all those that remember the fateful February 2003 testimony of Colin Powell at the United Nations, where he held up the little vial of powder. It was supposed to be anthrax, or representing anthrax, and talked about how Saddam Hussein had these weapons of mass destruction, and we had to therefore go into Iraq. And Wilkerson, subsequent to that fateful and tragic and wrong and false assessment, recanted what he did. He is repentant of what he did. He's talked about this a lot. Of course, a lot of people died as a result of that. He was with us. And what's important about Larry Wilkerson is that since that time, he's worked to try to inform people of the, as he put it, sort of abjectly wrong judgments about security that the United States has gotten many times from intelligence people. Like, for example, what we've lived through recently with Russiagate, which is a completely hoked up, crazed enterprise that nonetheless occupied the nation, McCarthy-era style, for 2 years, and is still believed, still being pushed, in fact, by various media. So he was there. Now, these were the three Americans that were on the panel, and then they were joined by Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the founder and the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. And Helga's job there, first of all, because she had been organizing for 2 years to create a kind of international peace coalition, something that's met 53, 54 consecutive times, including today, every Friday for the past year and a half, year plus few months, a few weeks rather. And her job in this particular press conference that she was proposing the alternative being not merely a productive economic alternative, such as the one that we've put forward in terms of Southwest Asia or Gaza and Israel, if you will, what we call the Oasis Plan, something that was originally devised by her husband, Lyndon LaRouche, back in 1975. Not just that, but in the case of Ukraine and Russia, her full-throated endorsement for what is often referred to as the BRICS nations policies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I think what's important just to say about this is that, as people may have heard, and as you know, there's a group of 7 conference of Europeans who are meeting right now, and there will be a conference in Switzerland next week, a few days from now, which is supposed to be a so-called peace conference, which Zelensky called, but he didn't invite the Russians. Well, despite the fact that he didn't invite the Russians and that there was supposed to be somehow a negotiation about peace in Ukraine without Russia being present, Vladimir Putin has put forward a proposal. I think people have heard it so probably from today, which essentially states that the Russians are prepared to move toward ending the conflict, at least an immediate ceasefire in the conflict, but then that being something that would be the beginning of negotiations for peace. They've stipulated what they want. What they stipulated that they want is pretty much what they had actually said in 2022 in April, or March, April. It's a little bit more strict now than it was then. But what's important is that suddenly Zelensky and Biden and others are going to be in a freaked out mode about the fact that now they're going to have to discuss what the Russians have proposed. Because the Russians are now saying we are prepared at this moment to go to something like a ceasefire if the following conditions are discussable. And these are the conditions that we are proposing. And those conditions involve no Ukraine in NATO for obvious reasons. They've said over and over. It involves the idea of recognition of the integrity of the areas of Donetsk and Lugansk and the area around Zaporozhye. And notably, the Russians are not talking about Odessa, which some people, of course, who believe that Russia wants to go and conquer all of Europe, certainly believe that they want Odessa back. That's left out. They don't say that they regard Odessa as being a portion of what is the present new, if you want to put it that way, border, which characterizes the border of conflict. So this is important because that was a development that happened literally 24 hours after the press availability. What was key there, and as was mentioned already, there's a section from that conference, and we might want to actually go to that because it will kind of give people the mood, because the mood of the conference was extremely stark. And Scott Ritter, in particular, was insisting that the problem that you had, biggest problem, was not Biden per se. Yes, he's a big problem. It was not even Blinken or Sullivan per se. Yes, they're a very big problem, bigger problem perhaps even than Biden. But the problem of the complacency of the American people, the fact that people don't understand what war is, let alone what nuclear war is, and that this is not the kind of thing that you can't grade this on a curve. You can't figure out whether or not people are being a little realistic or more realistic, and some people have a better grasp of reality than others. That the present visit of the 4 vessels, Russian vessels in Cuba. As Ray McGovern was talking today on the Judge Napolitano show, and he pointed out that although there are all sorts of assurances being given that there are no nuclear weapons on any of those vessels, Ray said, I don't know that that's true. And I actually happen to believe that it isn't. Now, I don't think he was saying that from an informed standpoint. I think what he was trying to state was that the breakdown in communications between Russia and the United States is such that it could very well be, though he wasn't claiming it was the case, that there could be nuclear weapons right now 90 miles from Cuba, right, 90 miles from the border of Florida. And you wouldn't know, that is, American people wouldn't know, because they've been caused to be complacent, and they don't understand the degree to which Russia believes that they are facing an existential threat in the way in which NATO is conducting war against them, up to and including bombing portions of the early warning system of the nuclear system of Russia in Russian territory on Russian soil. So I think maybe that's all I would need to say, Diane. If you think we should go to that clip now, that might be good, or if you want to have a further discussion.
I think that's good. And then we'll go to Carl, and then we can open it up. So Dave, if you could play that clip of the Steve Starr question and answer.
Okay, my name's Stephen Starr. I'm a professor at the University of Missouri. I teach a class there on nuclear weapons, and I also recently published a book on nuclear high-altitude electromagnetic pulse. My question is for Colonel Wilkerson and Scott Ritter. As was mentioned, 3 of Russia's 10 nuclear early warning system radar sites were recently attacked by Ukrainian drones. Considering that these Russian radars are specifically designed to observe incoming nuclear-armed U.S. ICBMs and could not play any role in the Ukraine war, what do you think was the purpose of these attacks, and did the U.S. provide the targeting data for the drones that were used in the attacks?
Colonel, you outrank me.
The answer to your questions, I think, and this is somewhat speculation, but it's informed speculation, is yes. We knew all about it. We even provided targeting data. And why we did it, I have to answer by saying we're insane. They do not have, the Russians do not have the kind of sophisticated array of warning that we have in space. So this is very important to them. This is like our old distant early warning line, which never worked, but theirs works. And it has absolutely no capability of surveilling the battlefield in Ukraine. So what was the purpose of hitting it? I suspect the purpose of hitting it was something akin to the same purpose of taking out Nord Stream 2. It's absurd. It's insane. But this is the kind of thing we do today.
I would back up the Colonel by noting that, Microphone. Oh, microphone. Yeah. Thank you. I'm a Marine, so I'm used to projecting my voice without microphones. So, I'll use Air Force technology. But the United States and NATO employ what we call today intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets over Ukraine and around Ukraine. These drone attacks, I don't believe, could have penetrated Russian air defenses without access to real-time intelligence about where these air defenses are deployed, what the radar envelopes are, what the terrain features are, how you can use terrain masking, timing of attack, the specific route of attack. It's a very sophisticated plot that is beyond the capability of Ukraine to do on its own volition. So I agree with the Colonel that the United States was directly involved in the targeting of this. Now the question is, why would the United States do this? And I come back to one of my built-in assumptions is that we think the Russians are bluffing. We believe that if we can put enough pressure on Russia, that we will cause the Russians to quickly seek the negotiating table to bring an end to this conflict. A lot of what we have been doing against the Russians, using the Ukrainians as proxies, is timed to something that's scheduled to take place, I think, next week, the Swiss, peace conference. But the purpose of the Swiss peace conference isn't to seek peace, it's to create a global coalition who can put political pressure on Russia. And so there's a sequencing of trying to build this global coalition to put pressure on Russia and putting Russia in a state where it will respond to that pressure. And so these attacks that have been made against Russia's critical infrastructure, attacks made against Russian civilian targets, are all designed to wear down the resolve of the Russian government so they would respond to this pressure. This is lunacy in the extreme. Russia has a nuclear posture which clearly states that when its critical nuclear infrastructure is placed under threat, to include nuclear threat or conventional threat, that this warrants a threat of existential nature that can legitimately give Russia the green light to use their nuclear weapons in response. Russians aren't bluffing. They don't bluff. The Russians are highly responsible. They have a very mature posture and very mature leadership. Vladimir Putin's been in power for 25 years. You you get to know the lay of the land during that time. He is comfortable with where Russia is. He is comfortable with who Russia is. And he is comfortable with Russia's place in the world. He is not going to throw away a quarter of a century's work on a whim, on an urge, on miscalculation. But at the end of the day, when he is confronted with an existential threat, he will respond in accordance with Russian doctrine. And that means nuclear weapons. This is a gross miscalculation on the part of the Ukrainians, on the part of the United States, and on the part of all the allies that we have tried to bring together to put this pressure on Russia. We don't understand Russia, which is why I believe the best thing we can do as Americans is to begin talking to the Russians, begin listening to the Russians, begin learning about the Russians so that we better understand who they are, what they want, and we can make responsible policies based upon that.
Colonel Wilkerson, any thoughts? What he asked?
What Scott just said. I'm told, and I believe it, that Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan cannot talk to Sergei Lavrov. They cannot pick up the telephone and talk to one of the most accomplished diplomats on the face of the earth, Sergei Lavrov. That's absurd. What do you do diplomacy for? Whom do you talk to most urgently with diplomacy? Your enemies, not your friends. Talk to your friends on a cell phone anytime you want to. You talk to your enemies or your would-be enemies or your pretend enemies, but you definitely don't forbid your top diplomat from talking to the top diplomat of the country you're most embroiled with and most dangerously embroiled with.
Colonel Black, did you have something you wanted to?
No, I thought I would just add the fact that when it comes to the drone attacks on the radar sites that defend Moscow, this was a coordinated thing. This was not simply somebody from Ukraine, maybe with some permission from some Americans to go ahead and do this, but it was orchestrated because you had the attack on the early warning system. You had the attack on the nuclear bombers. You had the integration and the adjustment of the F-16 jets to make them nuclear capable and nuclear ready. All of these things coming together. Maybe it was an effort to bluff, to raise the stakes on the Russians, or maybe it was simply the way that the Pentagon does to make sure that if they anticipate that the commander-in-chief might take a certain action, that they put things in place to make sure that they're ready for it. In either event, it is a very dangerous thing because it just ratchets up. If you're bluffing, there's always a chance that the other person calls your bluff. And if he calls the bluff, it is Russia's general position that they don't fight a limited nuclear war. Their idea is that nuclear war is an all-out war. We have this idea, well, maybe you can tinker around. Maybe you can have a little nuclear war, and that'll work out and everybody will back down. Sometimes people don't back down. And to gamble the existence of humanity on whether somebody will back down, it's one thing if you got $50 on a card table in a poker game, but you're actually putting all of humanity on the table. We're the chips, and we've got reckless people gambling our lives with us.
Thank you. So, Carl, with that, why don't you go ahead?
All right, well, I can't help but there's a couple of points that I want to make. One is the obvious direct response to the problem of diplomacy that Scott Ritter and Larry Wilkerson both pointed out, which is the contrast with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is that during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, those 13 days, and also before that, and particularly long after that, the U.S., Washington and Moscow never stopped talking. There was communications via various back channels between the Kennedy administration and the Russian embassy. There was official communications. There was direct correspondence between Kennedy and Khrushchev. And the crisis could not have been overcome without any of that. None of that is happening now, as Scott Ritter and Colonel Wilkerson both pointed out. So that's one point. But my second point, directly related to the problem of the drone attacks on the Russian radar stations, which is that in October of 2022, I don't know how many people remember this, but I remember it very clearly. I wrote about it at the time. In October of 2022, the USS West Virginia, an Ohio-class nuclear ballistic missile submarine, surfaced in the Arabian Sea. Now, officially, according to U.S. Central Command, it surfaced in order to take on board the commander of CENTCOM, General Kurilla, in order to get a tour of the boat and to meet with to get an understanding of the mission of this nuclear ballistic missile submarine. Now, the Arabian Sea is part of the area covered by the two radars that were attacked, the Amarvir radar in Krasnodar and the Orsk radar about 1,000 kilometers to the east. So obviously, the conclusion that should be drawn is that the Arabian Sea is a potential launch point for U.S. Trident ballistic missiles against Russia, targeting the radars and targeting Russian strategic bases in that part of the country. And the Russians took it as a message from the U.S. that the U.S. believes, this was reported in the Russian media, that Russia believes that that Russia takes it as a message that the U.S. believes it could launch a disarming nuclear first strike against Russia. And I don't think that point can be stressed enough. And there is nuclear posturing by the U.S. that suggested that, in fact, that is part of U.S. doctrine, to be able to launch a disarming strike against Russia, and maybe against also China too. But that has not been discussed publicly quite as much. But so that's. But the point that I draw from that is the point that, in fact, there's a popular belief that the U.S. has not used nuclear weapons since 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in fact, one of the points that Daniel Ellsberg, who was mentioned by Colonel Wilkerson earlier in the press conference, discussion that he had with him before he died, Ellsberg wrote a book called The Doomsday Machine, and I recommend that everybody read it if you're not already familiar with it. And when he writes in the introduction, he dispenses with this myth that the U.S. has never used strategic nuclear weapons since 1945. And I just want to read a few paragraphs from the introduction where he talks about this. He says, during the 2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump was reported to have asked a foreign policy advisor about nuclear weapons. And the quote from Trump was, "If we have them, why can't we use them?" The correct answer, Ellsberg writes, is we do. Contrary to the cliche that no nuclear weapons have been used since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, U.S. presidents have used our nuclear weapons dozens of times in crises, mostly in secret from the American public, though not from adversaries. They have used them in the precise way that a gun is used when it is pointed at someone in a confrontation, whether or not the trigger is pulled. To get one's way without pulling the trigger is a major purpose for owning a gun. Moreover, our extended deterrence over our allies in Europe or Japan rests on our preparedness and our frequently reiterated readiness to carry out threats of a first use, that is, initiation of limited nuclear attacks with short-range tactical missiles, and or implicitly to carry out a disarming first strike on the homeland of the USSR or Russia, mostly with long-range strategic weapons, in response to large non-nuclear attacks by its conventional forces or those of its allies. So that's really the kernel of U.S. Nuclear doctrine, is that first use. So I raised that at the press conference. Colonel Wilkerson responded to it. If you could play that portion, Dave, I think it would be. I think his answer is mostly speculative in certain ways, but it's informed speculation because Colonel Wilkerson has an understanding of how these things work. So if you could play that, Dave, so we can hear that.
Carl Osgood with EIR. I was happy that Colonel Wilkerson mentioned Daniel Ellsberg, because another thing that Daniel Ellsberg said, and I read this in his book, I never had the pleasure of meeting him in person, was that he said, contrary to popular myth, the popular view, the U.S. has always used nuclear weapons in the way that a criminal uses a gun in order to get what he wants, even if he doesn't pull the trigger. So my question for both Scott Ritter and Colonel Wilkerson is, how is the U.S. using nuclear weapons now?
Again, Colonel, I yield to you.
Is he muted? I think we're not getting an audio.
I'd say, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'd say it's been some time since I was in government and associated with nuclear weapons in any direct way. But I would surmise that we are using them the way we have used them throughout the time of our possession of them, including having them first, as the film Oppenheimer made sort of a graphic presentation of. And Lindsey Graham has given new resonance to with his illusion of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with respect to Gaza. Lindsey has reached new crescendos of insanity, in my view, and I'm from the same state he is, South Carolina. We use nuclear weapons as a backdrop for threatening whenever we need to use them. We talked about earlier the situation in the global South. Well, let's just look at what's happening with the rest of the world, is what I like to call it. Right now, according to the Office of Financial Assets Control, we have probably somewhere between 30 and 35 countries under draconian sanctions. We have a lot of individuals in addition to the countries under draconian sanctions. We are detested by 3.6 billion people in the world, is my guess, given the countries under sanction, given their nature, and given, in many cases, the absolute lack of any real reason to have them, and the fact that they might be pointed at the leadership of a state or a country, but they in fact are impacting the people more than the leadership, if the leadership at all. And so we have built up a body of people in the world that I estimate to be somewhere between a quarter and a third that hate our guts. Well, behind all of that, of course, is nuclear weapons. And we talked about this earlier, and Scott alluded to it. I'm a member of something called the All Volunteer Force Forum. As a matter of fact, I and General Dennis Leach founded it several years ago. And one of the things we have been doing is taking a good hard look at the American military today. And what Scott said, I can amplify 1,000 times over. We are so broken within the American military that we couldn't mobilize for war if we tried. Not only that, in the polling that we do, very sophisticated polling every year and have done for almost 3 decades, the propensity to serve of American youth in the draft age quadrant, roughly 18 to 24, is down to 9%, the lowest it's ever been. It's General H's and my conclusion that if we had a real war, most American youth would go to Canada or Mexico in the first 48 hours. So it would be impossible to mobilize this country. Well, what do we do when we realize this? We threaten with nuclear weapons. We leave the nuclear weapons in the background. We hold the nuclear weapons up. We let people know. We don't have to tell too many, they know it. That's what scares me more than anything else about the bellicosity coming out of the White House with regard to China, with regard to Russia, with regard to Iran, because we can't back it up. We cannot back it up except with nuclear weapons. So you ask me the pregnant question, who will be the first in the world to use nuclear weapons? The same people who were the first in the world to use them in 1945. That is another thing Dan and I talked about, and we both agreed it is probably one of the most dangerous aspects of the current situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are very valid points, and that people really should be worried about that. And it fits with the trend that I've been observing in this for a number of years that I've been looking at these matters.
Good. Well, Dennis, let's go back to you. Any more reflections on what you've heard, developments, and don't forget to unmute.
Yes. One of the things that Larry Wilkerson said in the questions and answer a little bit later was that for those who were concerned about what might provoke somebody, a nation, to use nuclear weapons, Larry insisted, in fact, he repeated it, that if you want to know the nation that would be most likely to deploy nuclear weapons, it would be the United States. And that is one of the other reasons that it was urgent for us to do what we did with the press availability. Of course, Diane, you were also there, and it was important that there were several people that were there, either by virtue of the Zoom platform or in the room, who had been outspoken in their criticisms of the entirety of the character of what was done around the Iraq war or the Ukraine war, because it's not a Ukraine war. It's misidentified as a Ukraine war. It's an actual war with NATO. And I think that this idea, and Carl, I think I wanted to get a comment from you on this, is what do you think about the proposal that was made today by Putin, at least in the case of Napolitano's guests, which were Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern? They both thought that the proposal wasn't really directed at Zelensky, because Zelensky is essentially an illegal head of state at the moment. His term of office has run out. There's no provision under the Ukrainian constitution for someone to rule under martial law. There are secondary laws that were put in place in Ukraine, but they are in violation of the constitutional law. So he's actually doesn't have power. And therefore, it's questionable what he can even negotiate. But what's your view, given what you were there and heard, what you yourself have looked at, particularly since that, the press availability? What do you think is happening now? What do you think is unfolding right now? And how do you think not so much how would NATO respond, but how do you think the Russians are thinking about what they have done with this proposal they put forward?
Well, I haven't had a chance to fully review it yet. I've seen headlines on it, but what I would say is that the Russians have always, and Putin particularly, have always expressed a willingness and openness actually dialoguing towards talking about Russia's interests and how they can be met and how you can have peace with respect, while respecting the legitimate interests of Russia and every other country on the planet. And but he has also, ever since March, April period of 2022, the Russians have also repeatedly warned that as long as the war goes on, the conditions for peace will keep changing. Will keep changing. And so in March and April 2022, they were willing to withdraw all the way back to the 91 lines, except for the lines of Donetsk and Lugansk, what they were at that time. So they were really ready to go back to that. But the peace effort was sabotaged by Boris Johnson, and so the Russians were forced to set a different set of conditions if the war kept going on. That's what they've been doing over and over again. So, and I think the initiative today is another step on that. They're saying that to restore the original boundaries of the regions that are now partially belong to Russia, the original administrative boundaries, and otherwise agree to a ceasefire. I think is consistent, except for the change in conditions. I think it's consistent with what Putin has been talking about since this all began, going back 2 years, almost 2.5 years now. So they're going to continue that. Now, according to the headlines I saw, so far it's been totally rejected by both Zelensky and effectively by the U.S. I saw a quote from Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, who was in Brussels for the defense ministers meeting, NATO defense ministers meeting. He basically said, according to the brief quote that I saw, that Russia is in no position to dictate peace terms. So that's the attitude of the, I mean, the whole U.S. NATO combine has never respected Russia's legitimate interests. This goes back to the early 90s when, or about the fall of the Berlin Wall, when James Baker was promising Russia that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, and yet before the end of that year, the U.S. Defense Department was actually planning on the expansion of NATO, which then began in the mid-90s, 1997. So, and it continued despite Russian warnings, despite Russian complaints that the expansion of NATO was not something that they could tolerate. And I can't remember the name. George Kennan, late in his life, warned, I guess it was in the late 90s, when the first wave of NATO expansion took place. Kennan warned that this was the red line for Russia, that NATO expansion was the red line, and if it kept going, this would become really dangerous. And his warning proved quite prescient. So I'm really not expecting that the NATO led by the U.S. and Britain will accept the Putin proposal. But if the conditions warrant it, Putin will, I'm sure, make a similar proposal again sometime in the future. But it's been very consistent, I think. There's nothing in that sense, no great departure, but another opportunity that we should not miss, but probably will.
Mm-hmm. Diane, I had something I wanted to ask you, but if you want to respond first to Carl, I could wait.
Well, yeah, and then because, this idea of Russia's in no position to, Ukraine has lost. They are finished. Russia is the victor. The only reason why Ukraine hasn't surrendered or called for negotiations or ceasefire is because of the West continuing to urge them to fight, including now talking about ground troops or what is this draft for. But the other thing that Americans don't seem to take into account is the new order of the BRICS, the new paradigm, and we'll conclude, I think, with Helga's conclusion of this conference. Look, the US and the UK combined may have nuclear weapons, but we only represent 5% of the entire world's population. And if you add in Europe, maybe, I don't know, a lot of the European countries, the EU certainly is not very unified these days. NATO isn't very unified. Turkey is in NATO, but now they want to join the BRICS. How is that going to work? So, okay, maybe 10% of the population is part of this unholy alliance. 85% of the world, including their heads of state, recognizes the insanity of this and wants a new order with a more equitable policy and also more equitable, quote unquote, rules. Not the rules-based order that Biden speaks of, where they just make them up. They pull them out of certain parts of their anatomy and then change them whenever they feel is necessary, and whoever they apply to changes also. That's been rejected. And I think, in a sense, that also creates a really great danger, because if you're that delusional when you represent 5% of the entire world's population, but you're going to run around the planet lecturing on democracy. You want to put Julian Assange in prison for 175 years, and you're lecturing about human rights. You have people in public housing in New York City who don't have gas in their gas stoves, don't have drinkable water coming out of their faucets. That's in many cities. And you're going to lecture other nations. There's a real disconnect. And I think that's part of the danger. And I think if Americans had the opportunity to understand more about the shift that's occurred, people might feel a little bit less hopeless, that there actually is a lot that we can do, because most of the world has already changed in a different direction, and they've rejected this colonial legacy. That's all I wanted to add.
I just wanted to bring out, Diane, that at the press conference, I thought it was interesting that Scott Ritter kept talking about the voters. He talked about the idea of demonstrations. He talked about the idea about not thinking that your vote doesn't count. He used the French elections, in particular Macron. and given, your candidacy and what you represented, you're being down there. What's your view of what he said, and also of the role that Americans could play? And people often feel a little bit, it's nuclear war. What can I do? But he certainly didn't have that attitude at all.
Right. Well, maybe there's a really short, it's 3 minutes of him going through this, and then I will answer that if Dave could play that short clip of Scott talking about that very question.
We're in an election year, and I can say firsthand, and I'm sure everybody has similar stories, there's just people that don't believe their vote counts anymore. Or when they look at the candidates that are likely to be on the ballot, they just say, we don't like any of them. And this is all legitimate. But for the people that say, what power is democracy? What power is the vote? Ask Emmanuel Macron. All right? The vote matters. Your vote matters. Everybody votes matters. We're here today to talk about the dangers of nuclear war. As Colonel Wilkerson said, Joe Biden and his administration may be formulating policy that promotes the potential of nuclear conflict because that's the only way out for Joe. He's desperate. He can't be seen as being weak. Why don't we, the people, tell Joe that it ain't weak to walk away from nuclear war? And if Joe doesn't want to listen, why don't we tell Donald Trump, you're not weak by not promoting nuclear war? Why don't we get enough Americans in the street before the election to say, we are the swing vote, the people that don't want nuclear war. And if you don't win us over, we're not voting for you, and you could lose the election. Well, you see, we live in an evenly divided nation right now. And if we can get enough people together, united in the notion that America needs to be walking away from nuclear war, not sleepwalking towards nuclear war, our vote will matter. Our vote will matter. So we need to find a way to capture this. I'm not the solution, but I'll tell you this. On September 28th, we're putting together a rally in Kingston. If we can get 1 million people in the streets, shut down the thruway like we did in Woodstock, that sends a signal. And if we have similar rallies in every swing state in America, where people just got up one day, Saturday, September 28th, stood up and said, I'm angry as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. Listen to me or lose the election. They will listen, and we know this is true, because on June of 1982, 1 million people went into the streets of Central Park, New York, and they protested against nuclear war. They protested in favor of arms control. The President of the United States at that time was a crazy, red-hating man named Ronald Reagan. Evil empire. 5 years later, he signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, beginning a process, as Colonel Wilkerson said, led to getting rid of nuclear warheads, getting rid of nuclear weapons. We can do it. We, the people of the United States, government of...
So just for people who are not aware, there's been some discussion. One, what just happened in Europe, what happened with Macron is that his party is on the outs, and he has called for snap elections June 30th. We had a demonstration of the power of the vote in the United States when, over the summer, people who were opposing the genocide, which is being committed by Israel with our weapons and our blessing against the people of Gaza, people decided to vote uncommitted. That happened in Michigan, Minnesota. They wanted to send a message to Biden. So Biden even went as far as to pretend he was negotiating for a ceasefire. He wasn't really, but he felt obligated to do that because it does matter. People want to be reelected. Even in the state of New York, and it was so shocking here that they didn't cover it or they falsified the data. New York doesn't have an uncommitted vote. They have what a blank vote, which is you go in, and in this case, it was the April 2nd presidential primary. You request a ballot and you just don't vote for anyone. And in the state of New York in April, that was 12 to 13%. In many cases, that vote is enough of a margin to make Biden lose or to make Trump lose. It's enough to change the outcome of the election. That's what Scott's getting at. And of course, my campaign for US Senate, we can't, and I don't think he's proposing this, we can't wait until November. The point is the threat that we have the power to deliver is now, by letting these people know that if they don't stop thermonuclear war, that they're not going to be reelected, provided we're still alive to have an election. So I think perhaps we should go to what Helga was asserting at the end, unless you, Carl or Dennis, has some other thoughts that you wanted to raise.
No, I think it's probably a good idea.
Carl, anything?
Yeah, I agree with Dennis.
I would say that this is a very important point, because I don't think Americans, we are not used to thinking of ourselves as being a minor player or irrelevant to the unfolding of history. The American Revolution was a great victory for mankind, and we had many statesmen and women, not as president, unfortunately so far, or maybe fortunately in the case of Hillary Clinton, but who understood that the United States had a special role to play. President Kennedy emphatically understood that. Abraham Lincoln, John Quincy Adams, of course, our founding fathers understood that. Lyndon LaRouche understood it very clearly, that because of the principles stated in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution about the relationship of our nation to the principles of natural law, and the question of the unique nature of human life above any animal species, and that our Constitution was supposed to protect that we had a unique role in the planet for the good, for justice, a point that we would draw a line against horror and atrocity by upholding a certain principle, not running around invading people and overthrowing governments. But we've lost that. And so if we don't uphold that, frankly, our nation becomes irrelevant. The danger is that we could hurl a nuclear weapon somewhere and end everything. And Helga says something at the end of this conference, which I think begins to get at that. And also, I think people should consider, how do revolutionary moments occur? How was it that the Berlin Wall came down non-violently? What led up to that? What were the factors involved in that? Because I think we really are on the cusp of something very, very big, but also that's why it's so very, very dangerous. So Dave, why don't you go ahead and play Helga's clip, and I think that will be the conclusion of this evening's discussion, her conclusion of that meeting.
I would like to invite you to get active immediately, not just wait for the US election, because, and I want you to join the International Peace Coalition. The next meeting is Friday, 5 o'clock European time, 11 o'clock US time. The reason why this is so urgent is because we are going, in my view, in the most important and dangerous period probably in all of history. The reasons for this is the following. We have beginning of July, the NATO annual summit. And I think given the fact that the Ukrainian war is really running into trouble, and but for the new weapon systems, it would have ended already, because it's the people are not there, the soldiers are not there. And, this will be an incredible moment, because NATO has an immense reputation problem, an image loss in the eyes of the world. NATO already lost shamefully against 65,000 Taliban fighters in Afghanistan and left Kabul in August 21. You all remember the images of people hanging onto the airplanes, trying to get out. They were abandoned, by the way, by the NATO, the so-called locals who had worked with NATO for 20 years were left behind. That should be a lesson also for the Philippines and the Ukrainians. And now the war in the Ukraine is lost by NATO. I mean, what does it mean if the entire force of NATO, with all the weapons and all the incredible monies which were spent, were not able to defeat the Russian army, which has a military budget which is about 10% of that of the United States, an image loss which is incredible, and that increases for the time being the danger, that a nuclear escalation could happen out of this dynamic. Then we have another problem. We have the idiotic policy that some people, Janet Yellen, the EU, they want to confiscate the Russian assets, which they confiscated already, but to spend them for Ukraine. Now, even the IMF has warned that they should not do that because that would put at risk the entire financial system, because Russia already has announced that they will retaliate and confiscate US and European assets, and that could trigger a whole chain reaction of such developments, because that will be read by the global south as one more reason to de-dollarize, because it's not safe to be in the dollar. Then you have the BRICS summit in October. That will be in all likelihood a very spectacular event where many, many more countries, up to now there were 59 countries who announced that they want to be part of this new system. That will be also, a point where the West has to really reflect what to do. And then naturally comes the November election. Now, I think we need to think not only of mobilizing in this entire period between now and the US election, because I think this is an extremely dangerous period, but also because if we do not introduce another component into our thinking, a new way of approaching the whole idea of humanity, of are we the creative species or not. And I would like you to remember what happened actually in 1945 when Germany was completely a rubble field. You remember the pictures of Dresden after the bombardment. Many other cities were looking almost like that. And at that point, and that is, by the way, one of the reasons, responding to the earlier questions, would the Western leaders today not do what they do if they would understand nuclear war? I think the problem is a generational and a cultural problem, because I remember very well in Europe, the World War II generations, they knew what war was, and they told our generation, we didn't experience it, but I have all the stories told by my grandparents, by my parents and relatives, about the horrors of war. And that is sort of in my genes. And, the new generation, which is completely shallow-minded, and they don't know history, they don't know culture, they don't know what the classics is. So they are being brainwashed by all of these manipulations, and they just don't get it. And I think, the older people and the younger people have to get together. Now, what happened in 1945 was that the shock about how could Germany, this beautiful pearl in the nations of countries, which it was during the time of Bach, of Mozart, Beethoven, of Schiller, of Goethe, how could such a nation which had produced so many inventors and so many creative individuals sink so deep to the level of Nazism and the 12 years of the horror show of what Nazism meant? Well, I think people were so shocked that there was a soul surging, and people said, we have to give ourselves a higher lawfulness, that this can never happen again. And there was a big debate about natural law, that we have to have something which is more fundamental than positive law or whatever people do and say. And that this natural law in European history was the idea that there is a higher lawfulness which is built in creation, which we have to access and which is valid and which is functioning in the real world. Now, unfortunately, that debate about the use of natural law as a very practical aspect in legislation, in lawfulness, was abandoned. It was abandoned by the occupying powers. It was vanished by the Frankfurt School. It was eliminated by the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which started the re-education to eliminate any such profound ideas. And that is part of the tragedy why people don't remember this period, which was a very important moment of recollection. How could this tragedy have happened? And that is why in the new security and development architecture, which I have proposed, the last three principles refer to these epistemological foundations on which the new paradigm has to be built. So I would urge you to look at that, study it, and let us bring this into the debate, because I think we need this higher lawfulness. In Europe, it was called natural law. In India, it is called cosmology. In China, it was called the mandate of the heaven. And, you know, in every great culture and nation, you had this idea that there is such a higher lawfulness on which we have to agree because we are human beings. And I think that has to be part of the discussion, because we have to uplift humanity very, very rapidly to a higher level of morality if we want to survive this great danger.